So thank you very much for the invitation. I'm really happy to be here, especially a Friday at 4:30 in the afternoon, but we will see how it goes. So now I'm working in a new think tank inside the Lewis University. So it's the Lewis Institute for European Analysis and Policy in Rome. So it's a new think tank between the academic world and and to have a link also with the public institutions. So this is a bit the objective. So we teach at Lewis, and then we analyze a bit the developments in industrial policy in the EU and in Italy, and economic policies in Italy in general. And we also intend to provide political recommendations for institutions and private actors. So there I'm in charge of EU industrial policy. Yeah, it's really new. We was created in May 2023, and I began to work on it, to work there in September 2023, just before finishing my PhD, which was on the history of industrial policy. So I have two hats. I'm a researcher on the history of industrial policy and current industrial policy, and I try also to see a bit what's happened and to improve the EU industrial policy framework. So today I will speak about the past of industrial policy and the current challenges. So the idea is to see what's happening now in a long-term perspective, because what I argue is that the current challenges were also similar that as it was before, so especially in the 70s, 80s. Yeah. So industrial policy is back in all industrial countries. So as you already know, normally. Now EU industrial policy is focused for the twin transition, environmental and digital transition, and the achievement of strategic autonomy. In the context of intensification of US-China tech war, acceleration of climate change, increasing EU industrial and technological dependence, security challenges, so now especially with the war in Ukraine and China. So now we have many developments in EU industrial policy, so since the 2010s. So it was labeled as a geoeconomic turn in industrial policy by many researchers. But to see a bit that, because for them, you know, we have now a revival of industrial policy with a lot of new tools, and there was no industrial policy in the past. So what I want to ask today as a question, research question, do these policies, or these current policies, represent a fundamental change from the past? So the argument that I'm defending in a recent paper is that despite the current political discourse and geopolitical context, so special geopolitical context, and creation of new industrial policy tools, there's a persistence of government system of industrial policy since the 80s. So the structural constraints for genuine EU industrial policy have remained. So you have still divergent national strategies and rivalries between the different companies because of the existence of different national approaches to industrial policy, and also the fact that you have an historical promotion of national champions inside every member state. So every government is still defending its national champions. Then you have also limited competition commission competences in EU industrial policy. So the legal basis is still the article of the Maastricht Treaty. It hasn't changed fundamentally, which promoted an horizontal EU industrial policy and the promotion of competition. And so it gives really a weak base for EU industrial policy. Then you have also a chronic underfunding of EU industrial policy initiative, which is a big challenge right now, if you have read, for example, the recent Draghi report, which was published last September. Then you have still policy domain tensions, so inside the European Commissions. So you have conflict between industrial policy objectives and the defense of competition law. Then the dilemma of trade liberalization or protectionism. Then also you have ideological conflicts and structural foreign dependence of European industry. You have still the problem of transatlantic dependency. So because you have a historical military relationship with the US, so especially some countries, especially in the East, for example. The EU recurring technological gap, so you have a big technological dependence of the EU on the US, for example, and growing dependence now on US energy supply, so since the beginning of the war in Ukraine. So in this presentation, I will speak a bit about the 70s and 80s, which I analyzed in my PhD thesis. Then I will speak about what's happening since the financial economic crisis, 2008, 2010. Then I will do a comparative analysis of the two periods, and then I will conclude with some conclusions. So what's happening in the 70s and 80s? You have big external challenges. You had an energy crisis, so you have the oil shock of 73, and then the second oil shock in 79, and the big rise of inflation in every European country. You have the rise of trade protectionism. So Japan has its border relatively close, and you have also big trade protectionist policies by Carter and Reagan administration in the US. So in the second half of the 70s and the beginning and the 80s, because Reagan remained the whole decade. Then a US technological dominance in high-tech sectors. So what I argued in a paper that I put at your disposal, so it was a policy paper published in our report on industrial policy that we published last September, is that the US technological dominance was because all the actions of the EU were, the EU was late in those sectors because of the structural problems of the European Community governance. Then so this is really a problem that was pointed out at the end of the 60s. So we talked about the American challenge. It was a big thing in the debates in those years. Then you had also Japanese industrial and technological competition. Then the emergence of the third world as industrial competitors. That's because Ferguson talked about the shock of the global in his book. So it was an expression by Ferguson, the shock of the global for the European communities in the 70s, 80s. It's not working. So about the American challenge, you have the famous book by Jean-Jacques Servan-Schreiber, so a French author. Big influential book. And then you have this book with Christopher Layton, who raised the problem of the increase of US FDI in Europe at the end of the 60s. So Christopher Layton was a British academic. He was, after that, he was head of cabinet of the Commissioner for Industrial Affairs, Altero Spinelli, which is famous for his federalist ideas and his battle against fascism in the 40s. So it was really the man who elaborated all the digital policy, EU digital policy in the 70s. So why there was an American challenge? Because there was a big interventionist industrial policy from the US. So you had strong public agency intervention through the Department of Defense entities, so DARPA, NASA since the Second World War. Then the focus on dual-use technology projects, so benefiting both military and civilian sectors, what we didn't have in the EU for a long time, and disruptive innovation. Also, the US could benefit with the world's largest domestic market, providing big economic of scale, highly skilled workforce, innovative managerial practices. For example, you had the example of IBM which had really interesting managerial practices, which had the consequence the big development of IBM in the 50s and 60s. Then, so the consequence was a significant development of US high-tech industries in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and rapid increase in foreign direct investment in Japan and in Europe. So, as a result, US companies, IBM, Honeywell, for example, dominated 70% of European market by the late 60s. You had, after that, you have the Japanese challenge. So you had also an interventionist industrial policy in Japan, very important, with the Ministry of Industry of Trade, direct administrative guidance to influence company investments, Maltese control over foreign exchange and import of products and technology, authority to create rationalization cartels and industrial conglomerates, and then a big public financial support system with investment subsidies, and accelerated depreciation benefits, tax break, targeted incentives for selecting industries, public banking system with the Japanese Development Bank, for example, providing direct loans to the different companies. As a result, of these policies, you have a significant boost to the basic industries' competitiveness in Japan. So steel, shipbuilding in the 50s, 60s, and then after that, a strong development of high-tech sectors from 1970s onwards. So cars, computers, semiconductors, video recorders. So you can see a bit so the growth of Japanese car imports in selected European countries. So from the second half of 70s until the 80s. So it was a big challenge. So you can see a bit what's going on now with the Chinese car. It's a bit similar challenge. Then you have the emergence of the third world. So after decolonization, you have industrial development of developing countries thanks to the rapid street of technology and the globalization of markets. So you have the Kennedy round, for example, in the 60s. Then in those countries, expansionist industrial policy strategy and acquisition of Occidental technology. Emergence, and you have the emergence as a result of technologically advanced companies in South America and Southeast Asia. So you have Pemex, for example, in the oil sectors in Mexico, or Petrobras in Brazil, or POSCO, so still a South Korean steel company. The third one had this advantage of low labor costs, and then the other, this expansionist industrial policy and the special context. As a result, you had a rise of exports to the EU of raw materials and products from basic sectors, steel and textile, since the beginning of the 60s, and it was accentuated by the oil crisis at the beginning of the 70s. At that time, you have big problem to respond to this challenge in community policy. So at that time, you didn't have the EU, it was the European community. So you had three communities. You have the steel and coal, the coal and steel community, the Euratom community for the atomic energy, and the European community. First, so the historical rivalry between the different national business elites and the member states. So because of the important centralization of power and development of national states from the Middle Age to the 20th century, rival national mercantilist industrial policies to develop national infant industries with the adoption of trade barriers leading to fragmentation of the European trading space, and the creation during that period of national business elites defending their interests and putting pressure on governments to defend their interests. Then different national industrial policy strategy, industrial structure. So in France, you have traditionally a Colbertist, so the name of Ministry of Finance, Baptiste Colbert of Louis XIV. Interventionist industrial policy, so since the 18th century, with subsidies, nationalization, and economic planning strategy after World War II. For example, the money plan for the steel sector. In Italy, a big interventionist industrial policy also, so since the 19th century, since the unification of the country. And you have also, so a big event, the creation of the Institute for Ricostruzione Industriale in 1933. So you have the same dynamics also in Spain after the Spanish World War with the Instituto Nacional de Industria. In Netherlands, you had the planning policy since the end of World War II with the creation in 1945 of the Central Plan Bureau. And Belgium moved to a mixed economic regime in which the state intervened to a greater extent after World War II. And it was different in the Federal Republic of Germany because you had the adoption of a social market economy system in 1949 as a reaction of what happened during the Second World War with the Nazi regime. With the no promotion of sectoral industrial policy, the responsibility of industrial policy to different companies, and the objective of strengthening competition policy from the national authorities. Then you have 3 different legal frameworks for the development of European industry at that time because of the existence of 3 different communities and 3 different treaties for different sectors. So you had for the coal and steel community. So for me, is really one of the most important treaties of all time. Very interesting treaty because it had really everything inside. So it was for the coal and steel sectors because of the importance for the economy, the European economy at that time, and also because of the importance just after the Second World War. So the importance for the defense sector and to the rebuilding of the economy, with horizontal and vertical instruments for industrial policy. So you had the objective of the creation of a common market for coal and steel. So with provisions for removal of barriers inside the common market, fight against unfair price competition practices, prohibition of state aid, so Article 4, prohibition of cartels, so because what happened during the Second World War, so the German cartels especially, and a provision for merger control, which was really innovative, as you will see when we will analyze the EEC Treaty, so the commonly called the Treaty of Rome. Then the obligation for the high authorities, so the ancestor of the European Commission, to create economic and social research programs, so for the workers and also for the strengthening of the competitiveness of the steel industry. Big production planning tools, so because almost every country at that time was defending planning policy, with the obligation for the high authority to put in place general objectives for production and consumption, and then to provide loans for investment projects based on opinions made by the high authority. Then the obligation, so it was really, in the treaty they said that really the high authority has the objective to improve the life of workers also. So just was an economy and a treaty pleading for promoting economic measures. It was really something with the big social policies. So add to the adoption of workers and social research programs. So for example, to improve the health in the mines, the coal mines, for example. Then you had the building of the houses for the workers after that. Financial own resources. So the high authority didn't have to ask for member states to have money because you have a tax on the coal and crude steel production in the treaty. Very, very important measures if you see what's happening right now. The big problem now is that we need money. Then market regulation instruments in the event of manifest crisis. So they were really the most interventionist measures. So there were the possibility with the Article 58 to impose mandatory production quotas for production, so of steel production in case of crisis and coal. And 61, so the imposition of mandatory minimum prices. So it was used by the Commission at the end of the 70s. Then the Euratom industrial policy instruments, you have also interesting instruments in that treaty. So it was just for the civil nuclear industry, which is funny is that France promoted that treaty, but at the end they did everything to have the failure of that treaty. You have the provision for the abolition of custom duties, so like the ECC treaty, and quantitative restriction of trade of raw materials and products from the sectors, production planning tools, so like the ECC treaty, periodic programs for production, consumption, examination of investment projects, possibility to participate, so the Euratom Commission, financially in joint undertakings, provisions to promote research policy in the sectors. Also, you have the creation, it provided the creation of a Euratom supply agency, so to organize the supply of that industry. And you had also the possibility for the Commission to negotiate international agreement for the sector. So the ECC industrial, the ECC treaty provision were completely different because it was signed after, so it was almost 6 years after the ECC treaty. So the context was different. So the member states didn't want to give so much power to higher authority. So it was a framework treaty, so with no specific industrial policy instruments. So the idea was not to give too many powers to the Commission for, big instruments for national sovereignty industrial policy. You had no provision concerning environmental and research policies. So environmental policy, it was promoted through the research programs of the ECC treaty, and research policies which were in the two former treaties. Provision to establish a custom union, so the big objective. Provisions for the harmonization of national law, a flexible state aid regime, so we can talk about that in discussion if you want, because it's really one of my favorite topics, state aid law and policy. Antitrust provisions, but no merger control. So merger control, the first merger control law was approved in 1999. So, and it was pushed by the Commission from 1973. So imagine all the time to negotiate, because it's where it was really important for national sovereignty, of course. Instrument to promote the common trade policies, then the creation of the European Investment Bank, but it was mainly a regional policy tool. So you have now this big debate to use the EIB to finance industrial policy, especially defense industrial policy. So because, it was not provided, this role was not provided in the treaty, the EC treaty, because you had treaties of Rome, Euratom, and the EC treaty. And provisions also, so it's not really well known. I think almost nobody knows that because of the debate of the Treaty of Rome, the neoliberal provisions, and so forth. You had provision also to apply emergency economic measures, but it was subjected to anonymity of the member states, so it was impossible to be applied. Then, in this context of these three challenges, so American, Japanese, and the expansion of the third world, you have initiative from the European Commission in the 60s. So the so-called Colonna plans. So Guido di Colonna was the Italian commissioner for industrial affairs and the common market. So it was the first one, first commissioner for industrial affairs, because industrial policy was not naturally a competence for the Commission to expect at the exception of the high authority, with the objective to complete the common market, so the big objective of the ECC treaty, and also the promotion of interventionist measures to create a EC common research policy, because it was not provided by the EC treaty, and the promotion of big European champions. So the idea was really to create big European companies to rivalize with the big US companies at that time. So for example, IBM. And then you have the federalist Altiero Spinelli. So he was commissioner during 6 years during 6 years in the 70s, which is really an interesting character for me. So I analyze a bit his thinkings in an article, with the promotion of a federalist industrial policy based on the ECC model. So the objective of the 70s is really to use the ECC treaty as a model to provide the interventionist measures for the other sectors. So what is interesting is that in the communication of the Commission, you can see terms like industrial autonomy. So the objective is to have industrial autonomy. And there was the fear to have a technological dependency from the US. So it is something that you can see in the current documents of the European Commission, for example. It's just that we don't have the term strategic autonomy or sovereignty for obvious reasons. But there were little success from this initiative from the European Commission due to opposition from member states. So because there was debate, ideological debates about the nature of industrial policy, why we have to have an industrial policy, and so it blocked all the initiatives. So you had mainly an intergovernmental approach for industrial policy until the mid-1970s. So at the exception, of course, of the coal and steel sector, well, especially the steel sector, because the coal sector had a decline from the 60s. Then you have the opposition from companies to the European Commission strategy. So because of the structural problems that I mentioned before, for example, you have the Unidata project. It was promoted by the Commission at that time is to create a big industrial champions in the IT sector. So with the French companies, Dutch companies, and German. And it was, it led to a failure in 1975. You had also the French government who didn't want to have the French companies with the, an association with, between the French and the German companies at that time. So big failure of those initiatives from the European Commission. So as always, so during the European integration process, you have to have a crisis to have the things to be things can change a bit. You really have to have a crisis for the policies to change. So you have a big crisis of European industry since 1975 with growing into external competition and the oil shock that I mentioned before. And the European Commission tried to formulate sectoral plans in favor of crisis sectors, the so-called basic or crisis sectors, shipbuilding, steel, textiles. So for steel, you had the ECC treaty provisions. And for the other ones, the d'Avignon, so the Belgian commissioner at that time for industrial affairs, he was the head of cabinet of Paul Rispac, who was Belgian prime minister. He used the ECC treaty provisions for the other sectors. But from 1978, you have the German, the Danish governments that tried to stop this interventionist strategy. And so the Commission tried to have a balance between horizontal and sectoral measures with new initiatives in favor of growth sectors, so-called growth sectors, so aeronautics, IT. Then development of innovation, research policy for other sectors than coal and steel, atomic energy. And the building of the common market, which was not established at that time, is still not completed. If you have read the recent L'État report, which was published last March. So you had this vision was enshrined in the report on sentence structural aspect of growth on 1978, so to meet these challenges. So you have that time all this push for in horizontal strategy, but you had still sectoral policies. You have for the growth sectors, for example, the creation of specific initiative in favor of the aeronautics, IT, telecommunication, and electronic circuit technology industry. So you had sectoral research programs, for example, like ESPRIT, WAYS, no, ESPRIT for information technologies, and WAYS for telecommunication. Then everything changed in 1979 when you had the second oil shock with the worsening of the situation of European industry. Because you have the gradual change of national economic policy priorities. So you have right-wing governments coming, so especially the Thatcher government in the UK. Then you had the Reagan administration, which will come a bit later. And then the rise of inflation. So the countries began to apply austerity measures. So there was a big gradual change in national economic policies, priorities at that time. Interventionism was not in fashion anymore. So the new Town Commission from the beginning of the 80s tried to strengthen horizontal and competition policies. Competition policy because you had strong competence for that, and the horizontal policy because all the countries were defending that at that time. The only exception was the steel industry, so because of the special provision of the EC Treaty, and also because of the problem of the steel sector in every European state. So for example, Germany, they were against the imposition of mandatory production quotas, but they had to change their attitude because the German steel sector was asking for help, and there was really a big problem for the workers of that industry. So you have the state of manifest crisis, which was imposed in 1980. So the famous or infamous Article 58. And then the state aid state aid law was used as an industrial policy tool. So all the state aids had to respect to respect industrial policy objectives, so was structuring objectives. So it was the second Steel Aid Code of 1981. Excuse me, it's a bit late. Then big research programs, so I mentioned ESPRI, RACE, biotechnology also. Then the strategy of the Commission, as the interventionist strategy didn't work in the 70s, you have an horizontal industrial policy which was promoted, and also because the context was different, which will happen normally in a few months, I think, because of the current context. You have an horizontal industrial policy strategy, which will be published later in the year by the European Commission, for example. So harmonization of national technical standards, open up of public procurement, national procurement, creation of European standards to create that Brussels effect, as it was called by Annie Bradford recently, a special regulation to implement a lenient competition policy for growth sectors. Then automotive industry, a proposal for monitoring of state aid of the different European states, reduction of disparities between tax systems, block expansion regulation for distribution service agreements, and the promotion of a common trade policy by the Commission. But it failed because the member states didn't want to have this common trade policy for the automotive sector, because they really want to keep sovereignty in that area. But this research program were completely different than the US program or the Japanese research program, because you had the promotion of technological capacity of European companies through partnership open to foreign firms. So, you know, this idea of industrial sovereignty was a bit different in the US and Japan and the European communities. The European preference, you have the term European preference, which was defended in the documents of the European Commission at the end of the 70s and beginning of the 80s. But for the Commissioner, it was clear that it was not the industry of European origin, but industry in Europe. So IBM, for example, so US company in Europe, IBM Europe, can participate to the research programs. And it's still the same thing today. Because, you know, the European companies, they needed the technology because you had the globalization of technology, and they have to get the sufficient technology quickly. So you had the big debate of the IBM's participation in the ESPRI program in 1983, 1984. It was concluded by at the end, the European Commission said that it helped to establish IT standards at ISA level and set up in Europe. Then you have big joint ventures between different European companies and American companies, which were accepted by the Commission. Then a limited budget, because the opposition of frugal countries to allow a sufficient budget to the research programs of the European Commission, so especially the Thatcher government, but also the French government at that time. So at the end, what was the consequence? That you had increasing US technological dependency to the detriment of Japanese technology, because Japanese was seen as a systematic rival at that time by the EU. And so there was a debate, for example, of the because ICL was an English, British IT company. It was bought by a Japanese Fujitsu, Japanese company, to participate to Esprit. So you had conditions for them, but for the US companies, no. And then you have the big push from the second half of the 80s. So, as you know, that Jacques Delors was a big promoter of single market strategy. So, the completion of single market, which was there, you know, the objective since the 50s, Delors transformed it as a political objective. So, it had to be completed by 1992. And then you have the strengthening of research policy. So, at that time, you have the Star Wars program, for example, in the US. So it was the biggest industrial policy of all time. So big subsidies for the defense sector, with impact for the civilian sector, with protectionist policy also to participate in those that research program. So to benefit US companies. Promotion of education and training, and the gradual abandonment of intervention measures for traditional industrial sectors. So you have the big debate about the steel sector, of course, because there are still mandatory production quotas for the steel sector, decided by the European Commission. So imagine what was the impact of that. And then also all, you know, state aids, you know, in favor of industrial structure, it had to be prohibited if they didn't promote competitiveness. So you have the big debate about state aid in every country. So especially in interventionist countries like France, Italy, and then Spain, which will join the European communities in 1986. And the businesses had the main responsibility for industrial strategy. So it's clear if you see the communication of the European Commission of '89, so the so-called Bangerman communication.
10 minutes.
Okay, so yeah.
The referees to
so as you see, there's so you have these big structural constraints that I mentioned. So the difference between different domains, also the underfunding, the funding constraints, the openness of research programs, member states' opposition, and today, with you have the return, the so-called return of industrial policy. So we have you have now the Chinese and US challenges. So before it was Japan and US challenges, and you have a bit the same. You have the same governance. So you have big objectives put forward by the Commission, but the member states at the end are responsible for the application. So it led really to the failure of the Lisbon and Europe 2020 strategy in 2010. And then intensified pressure for interventionist industrial policies is the Alstom-Simon merger, the revival of national industrial policy. So as you know, intensification US-China tech war, you're going up in the digital sector, acceleration of climate change. But you know, you have a bit the same instruments, as competition policy is really the real tool to reach digital sovereignty. And all the plans in individual sectors, the member states, they are responsible to reach the objectives. And then with the COVID crisis and the Ukraine war, you have this intensification of pressure for interventionist industrial policy. And from the US, with the US Inflation Reduction Act, with tax credit and Buy American incentives. And then the Chinese interventionist industrial policy strategy, of course, and aggressive trade policy. So you have the reaction, big plans by the Commission, Net Zero Industry Act, Raw Material Act, Chips Act, new funding instruments. Then we try to promote a bit the dual-use research to reinforce the defense industry in Europe, promotion of European security. But at that time, these instruments, member states, they can decide if they want to apply them or they want to, and also of the FDI strategy, so towards different partners. So you have different visions inside Europe. For example, Hungary is in favor of more Chinese investment in the electric cars vehicle sector. Then a new defense industrial strategy, but at the end, member states are also responsible for the reduction of dependence from the US, for example, or the collaboration between the different member states for the supply of weapons or public procurement. So persistent constraints today with governance limitation, decentralized authority, limited European competency. So you have the same legal, same legal framework for industrial policy, as I said before. Member state implementation dependence, funding issues, fragmented R&D spending, weak coordination between national industrial policy strategies. So every country, for example, wants its battery factory. And then funding issues, you really have, you don't have a big European sovereignty defense. So you have the fragmentation of single markets. So the big countries with big pockets provide state aid. Strategic autonomy challenges, US dependencies, member state divergences on industrial policy in relation with competition, as I said before. So you have a big gap between the Commission's rhetoric in favor of strategic autonomy and the reality. So you can see a bit, so the comparison that I made about, so you have the different industrial strategy from Japan and China. Geopolitical context is a bit different, but you have also big tension with the Cold War, then Ukraine war, then China and US dependence, and then before it was US and Japan industrial and technological dependence. Utilities limitations, dependence of foreign actors for key industrial products, a continuing tension between industrial policy, free competition policy, and open trade policy strategy. So you can see dependence of Chinese photovoltaic imports in the EU, for example, or the US for the defense sector. So you have the big question now with Trump, with what will happen. So if from the LUNIP monthly brief on industrial policy that we publish every month, then you can see difference in funding, for example, for the ships sector, so between the EU and US. You can see the big difference. Or the issue of the funding of the EU Net Zero Industry Act. So you have a big proposal from the European Commission, and then at the end the Council gives almost nothing to fund the strategy. So this is a bit the summary. So if you can see a bit the difference between the different industrial strategy for between different competitors of the EU and the EU. So, conclusions. So, EU industrial policy, as I argued, governance has remained remarkably stable since the 1980s, despite big geopolitical challenges. So, you have new policy tools now, but they operate within unchanged decentralized framework. So, you have 4 key constraints that have remained since the 1970s: divergent national strategy, limited Commission competences, policy demand tension between free competition, open trade, industrial policy, and transatlantic dependencies. What are the strategic implications? That the EU lacks centralized authority and financial resources, so if you compare with the competitors, that the current governance model may not support the strategic autonomy goals, growing challenge at geopolitical competition and security risk, so with China, Russia, now the US with Trump. So you will see a bit if there will be Draghi or Trump effects on industrial policy. If the EU will be a junior US partner, so the question that we asked in our book on industrial policy, finalization of the EU, so natural EU on that issue, or the EU will become a global industrial power. So we will see what will happen. Thank you very much.